You are listening to the Critical Mass Radio Show, Orange County's business talk show, focused on exploring topics of interest to CEOs who are leading middle market companies. With your host, Richard Franzi.
Hello and welcome to Orange County's longest running business talk show. And yes, I am your host, Rick Franzi. And boy, do we have a good show planned for you. Why do you ask? Because as you can see, Cameron Fakouri is our guest. He is the founder and CEO of RezzyCheck. And we're going to be talking about all things concerning his business and his career. Cameron, welcome to the program.
Hey, appreciate you having me, Rick.
Let's get right into it. Whenever I have a founder such as you on our show, I have to start with the question, what was the motivation or maybe your inspiration to start your firm?
Yeah, that's a great question. My motivation originally was my father. I grew up watching him build his own firm, and I can kind of remember sitting around the dinner table listening to him talk about how he just landed a deal or about how some of the decisions he made that day were hard, and I've always known that I'd be starting something on my own. It was only just a matter of time, right? But I think it's important to also note that in order to get here, I had to start as an employee, right? I was a CPA, certified public accountant in Southern California, and I worked my way up through the ranks at various firms, including EY, Ernst & Young. But every step of my journey, I was always part of the recruiting team, right? I was networking with candidates, performing interviews, helping make hiring decisions. And I think that's when I realized, that really clicked with me. That's what got me pumped. I felt like I had a purpose doing that. And in keeping with my father's entrepreneurial spirit, I started RezzyCheck.
Okay, we're going to talk about the business model for RezzyCheck in a minute. But before we get there, in the year plus that you've been leading the firm and growing it, have you had any pivots? What have you learned? Is the business the same as you envisioned, or did the marketplace talk to you in a different way and you're doing something different?
Yeah, many pivots, Rick. And I'm sure you're probably sick of people saying this, but they say the riches are in the niches, right? So I had to learn that very fast. That was a big pivot for me. I'm a people pleaser. So I want to say yes to everybody. I want to say yes to every industry. But I realized I'm much more efficient, if I stay in my pocket. I may have fewer leads, but they'll be more fruitful, right? Another pivot for me was, giving more attention to this recruiting side of things. So now I work more B2B, and funny enough, that's kind of gotten me more career coaching exposure as well. So it opened more doors for career and talent coaching. For example, I'm working with a firm who wants an outsider's voice to come in and help their staff and managers with, for example, communication skills or best practices or how to be a top performer. So I think the lesson here is you shouldn't be afraid to pivot because you don't know what opportunities will open up.
Yeah, I always find it interesting when I have, again, founders on the show to talk about the pivots, because on one hand, you have an idea of what the business can be. On the other hand, you have all these potentially shining objects that are out there that may be distracting you. But it sounds like you found some more lucrative riches in the niches. So let's get to the business model then. And what I'd like you to sort of help us understand is, what is the niche? What problems do you solve for those clients? And then from a psychographic perspective or a persona, like who do you feel, Cameron, really knows how to work with you and your team at RezzyCheck to get the most value out of the engagement?
Yeah, absolutely. So RezzyCheck is a boutique, full-service recruiting firm, specializing in small to mid-sized public accounting firms. And because I'm a CPA myself, I know what firms are looking for when they're looking for candidates. So I can speak the language, I can get technical, I can put myself in their shoes because, I've been in their shoes. I've been on both sides of the table. So RezzyCheck is built by a CPA for CPAs. And, I'm also proud to say that we focus on quality, not quantity. I don't think it's any secret that recruiting is a saturated market. But what ends up happening is firms will get 100 resumes and, maybe not one of them is a match. So, I think it's important to have at least 2 to 3 touch points with the candidate before presenting them to the firm. Everyone's time is valuable. And to address the other parts of your question, I believe you were asking what the persona is of someone who would want to work with me. Is that right, Rick?
Yes.
So if you are a hiring firm who's looking for, who's looking to build a team, doesn't have maybe the time or the experience or the resources to do it themselves, they can call me, and I'm happy to bridge that gap between what you see on paper versus what you get in an interview versus who you actually hire. On the flip side, if you're a candidate and you're having trouble articulating your experience, your skills onto a resume or in an interview, I can help there as well. As a CPA, I know most of us aren't the most communicative or personable. So I like to drill down and, get to the core of what they can bring to the table.
I'd like to sit in this conversation for a little bit before we move on, Cameron, in that it's been my experience working also with middle market companies of all kinds of industries, etc. The hiring process is fraught with challenges and a little bit of an emotion, because it's really hard for clients during a very brief period of time, the interview process, to really understand if they've hired the person. And I'd like your perspective on this. My sense is they're better at understanding if the person has the skills to do the job. They're not as comfortable or competent as understanding if the person culturally will fit their company. What is your experience, and how do you address that with your clients?
You hit the nail on the head right there. So it's a mixture of the candidate trying to dress up their resume as best as possible, and the firm just not doing a good enough job learning about the candidate. So, I come from a place of transparency and honesty on both sides. I want to make sure the candidate knows exactly what they're getting at this firm, what they're looking for. Are they looking for someone who's technical, someone who's communicative? Do they need to be client facing? If so, I need to let that candidate know right from the start, this is what they want. These are the parameters of the salary and the benefits, so that there's no miscommunication, so that there's alignment throughout the whole process. And on the firm side, it's very similar. I work with them to figure out who exactly they're looking for. And Rick, more oftentimes than not, firms want the unicorn, right? So there's a lot of work with that. You can't always get the unicorn. If you wanted a unicorn, they're going to be starting their own firm, just like the firm did, right? So they're not going to be applying for the job. So it's a little bit of a push and pull, but I think honesty is the best policy. Being transparent about what each side expects is the kind of core at RezzyCheck, right? I don't know if you've worked with recruiters or know other recruiters. I was a candidate one time, and it seemed like they just wanted to kind of get you in the door and kind of wash their hands of it. At RezzyCheck, we try to keep the relationship ongoing, and it's not a one-done deal. We really want to see that candidate thrive, and we want to see the firm build a team that lasts.
I'm always fascinated by your profession, because not only do you have clients that are on a hiring company, but you have to also have clients that are the candidates. And so you're always kind of working two aspects of the business. And then the magic is being able to match the opportunity with the stable of candidates that you have.
100%. When you're working with people, people are entitled to change their minds. And, it's challenging. And that's why, again, I'll say it again, transparency is key. I want to make sure both sides know what they want, what they're getting into. At the end of the day, the candidate's looking for a forever home, a place that they can grow their career. And the firm is looking for teammates who can contribute and help to grow the business. So the interests are mutual. The trick is making sure it's a good match. And that's what I do.
One of my clients once referred to hiring in his mind as getting married after you have a speed date. You sort of, and I would think that's where part of your value is. You're really making sure there's a fundamental match before they even meet one another, so that there's some level of comfort that the candidate could fit the job if the hiring company is comfortable with the individual.
Absolutely. And in the recruiting world, you'll hear that dating analogy or that marriage analogy all the time. And it's not far from the truth, right? And like you said, that's why it's so important to ask the right questions, to have someone who's been in the industry that can find out what their real true experience is. What do they really know? What kind of culture are they looking for? So I think, yes, me drawing on my personal experience is definitely an advantage here. And, like I said, people are entitled to change their minds. My job here is to present the options and make sure everybody's happy.
Final question, then we'll move on just because I'm curious.
Yeah.
I've heard from others not in your specific niche, but in the recruiting profession, that when the economy is tight, to what you said earlier, employers get really particular because they feel like there's such a plethora of prospects. I have to make sure I'm going to find that unicorn. Has that been your experience as well? That when there's a perceived abundance of candidates, many employers can become overly critical to the qualities of the candidates that they're interviewing?
Yes and no. You can be overly critical, but what that tells me is that you're really not clear on what your goalposts are in a candidate. So, when we hammer down the details, do you want them to be technical? Do you want them to, have a certification, a CPA license or a master's degree? Well, I don't really need the master's degree. I'd prefer the CPA. Okay, now we're getting somewhere. So we work with the client to kind of narrow the scope of what they're actually looking for. A lot of times in your head, you have an idea of who you want. But when you sit down and really think about it, then you really start to visualize and, chip away at that unicorn to a feasible candidate that will match your firm culture and what you need in your team.
Such an important aspect of running a successful business, especially when you're growing and you need to recruit the people to keep the company in the momentum going. What a valuable service you and your team provide. Let's turn our focus a little bit inwardly to you. When I have founders on, especially early stage, I have to ask, having left the corporate world in a sense, being an employee, now you're an entrepreneur on your own. Congratulations. Have you ever had a feeling of maybe isolation or being a little bit alone on this journey?
Rick, I feel alone all the time. I feel like it's a prerequisite for being an entrepreneur, right? So yeah, in corporate world, you kind of have a path laid out. You kind of know where your career is going, what you need to do to get to where you want to go.
Right.
When you jump into the entrepreneurial world and start your own business, it's kind of like walking through a jungle with a machete in one hand, a compass in the other, and you're just trying to get through that jungle of decisions, right? To make sure you get to where you want to go. So yes, I do feel lonely at times. Thankfully, I do have a great support group. Of course, my lovely fiance has been so supportive, and I have some mentors that have been there for me. So, when I'm slashing through that forest of indecision, I have to remember I'm not really alone.
Yeah, it's, when you become an entrepreneur, you decide to bet on yourself, right? I can do something the market needs. That's also
Absolutely
very focusing because the results are directly related to you and only you. So
100%, I agree with that.
So let's think about maybe a piece of advice that somebody along the way Cameron gave you that has been helpful for you that you can pay it forward for my audience today. Can you think of something that would fit that model?
Yeah, there's a lot of advice out there, Rick. I'm sure you know. One piece of advice that really struck me was actually from a book. You probably have heard of it. It might have been on a show, How to Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill. And he says that, with every failure carries with it a seed of equal or greater success. And I think that's so important because I think what he's trying to say is you need to become comfortable with failure. And you might be thinking like, well, why do I thought I want to be successful. Why should I be comfortable with failure? I mean, if you think about it, it's like, how did you learn to walk as a kid, right? You fell. How did you find your wife or husband, your partner? You probably got rejected a few times. In my case, a lot of times, right? So those are all failures that help you learn. And so you constantly need to be learning, adjusting, pivoting. And once you become comfortable with that idea that I'm going to fail a lot, but when I do succeed, it's going to be worth it. I think that's a game changer, especially in your mindset. For sure, at least for me, it was.
Yeah, I love the writings of Napoleon Hill. I believe there's a lot to learn. That it's timeless, frankly. What he wrote
really
and serves us well today. And thank you for bringing that to mind, because the baseball season just ended, ladies and gentlemen, because here we are in November. And if you're living in Southern California, how can you avoid the Dodgers, the world champions, right?
Let's go.
Even the greatest hitter is probably 7 out of 10 times making an out of some sort, or at least not getting a productive hit. So failure is a part of being an entrepreneur, and that's really tough, because there's a lot of, especially in the early days, there's a lot of people that aren't quite getting the value proposition of what you're doing, and you got to believe in yourself and your business model to persist.
Yep. You got to stick with it. You got to stick through it. You got to keep that enthusiasm, failure after failure.
Right. And then on the other side of all those no's is the client that goes, yeah, I see how I could work with you. Thank you. And there's
it just takes one yes.
Yes. And then it's like, okay,
yes.
I'll go back into the fight. Now I'm ready.
Exactly.
In the early days of this business, I started my business in 07, 08, and that was like on the front end of the Great Recession, right? And I was working with small business owners, and I used to come home and tell my wife, they all can't say no, honey. I just have to keep talking to people, because sooner or later they're going to start saying yes. So I'm really curious to have you on the show because of all the things we've talked about, and especially maybe the next question, which is around artificial intelligence. I'd like your perspective of how do you view artificial intelligence, not like anything specific, but just like, is this the greatest invention mankind has ever come up with, or is it, the beginning of the end? I don't know. You tell me what you think. The next one is, how do you see it impacting your industry? And I think there's a psychological aspect in your space about AI, because we're starting now to hear the stories of job eliminations due to leveraging AI. And I think that has a chilling effect in many places, and also to the candidate as well as the employer. And then what are you doing with AI inside of RezzyCheck?
Wow, what a heavy question, Rick. You really stuck it to me on that one. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, AI is everywhere. You can't go 5 minutes without talking about AI because it's so prolific. It's a game changer, let's be honest. I mean, we're not at Skynet potential yet, right? We're not running away from androids or Terminators, but when Microsoft Excel first came out, they said accountants are no more. Accountants are going to be out of a job. In reality, it just made them more efficient. It made them better at what they do. So that's the kind of light I try to see AI. Personally in RezzyCheck, I use it for handling repetitive tasks, the boring tasks. I used to have to drag and drop resumes from emails into specific folders, make sure I update the tracking spreadsheet. Now I have that all automated. I love that. I could be sleeping. It could be just done on its own. For proofreading emails, maybe springboarding business plans, I will give your viewers a word of caution here, Rick. AI is great for starting an idea, for getting the framework, but the user, and I feel like I'm in a Tron movie right now, the user needs to take it across the finish line, right? We all know AI makes mistakes, whether you're using Copilot, Gemini, ChatGPT, right? So you got to be vigilant about that. And I think another part of your question was, regarding the job environments regarding AI. So, yeah, it's rough out there. Do I think it's going to affect the public accounting industry as CPAs? It might. I think we're starting to see that the lower levels are kind of being outsourced either to AI or across seas. But at the end of the day, tax and audit and public accounting, they need a human touch, right? So again, it might be taking care of some of the lower level tasks, but I think you're going to have that middle level still be there. And I'll say one more thing about this, Rick, about AI. As a recruiter, I've seen a lot of things, and some recruiting agencies are using an AI avatar instead of a real person to interview the candidate. I don't know if you've seen this. It's pretty funny.
Okay.
Yeah, and it seems like a good idea on paper, but again, it comes down to, you're hiring a human to work with other humans. I think there should be a human involved in this process,
Sounds
right?
logical. Yeah.
Yeah, and on the flip side, the candidates are doing it too. So they're fighting fire with fire. So I haven't run into this, but I've seen it where a candidate will have a similar AI avatar answering questions. So I don't think that does anybody any good. I am a proponent of using AI to practice for interviews to help you with your resume, 100%, to structure your responses. In fact, I have some AI tools on my website I can link you guys to later. But yeah, as Forrest Gump would say, that's all I have to say about that.
Excellent. Okay, let's talk about the future here. People don't become founders and CEOs of a company without a vision for the future. And I'm always curious, Carmen, can you share yours with us?
Yeah, I'm excited to see RezzyCheck grow throughout California and eventually be a multi-state operation, while still holding true to its roots. And its roots, in my opinion, are human to human contact, transparency, and alignment, right? I want RezzyCheck to be synonymous with quality. We're not a resume mill, we're a talent partner. And my relationship with my clients goes beyond just placing candidates. In a way, I feel like I'm following my dad's footsteps because he said that the relationship is what matters most. And I try to think about that every time I'm on a call.
Well, Cameron, this has been fun. And ladies and gentlemen, at the top of the show, I said we had a good one planned for you. Hopefully you've had some laughs like I did along with this interview, as well as picking up some great nuggets. So I know you're a busy entrepreneur, and thank you for being a guest on our program.
Thanks for having me, Rick. Pleasure to be here.
And thank you to the audience. You're part of Orange County's longest running business talk show and podcast. Cameron's episode will join our catalog of 1,600 plus episodes. If you happen to be an Orange County or Inland Empire entrepreneur and you'd like to be a guest on the show, it's really easy. Reach out to me, and between me and our producer, until the next time we all have a chance to be together, I hope each and every one of your business decisions move your companies in a positive direction.